Good afternoon. Welcome to Broadband Breakfast live online for Wednesday, October 28th, 2020. I'm Drew Clark, editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast, and very happy to have another great lineup for our discussion in this second of our five-part series on a no-nonsense guide to 5G. We have this fall kicked off two kind of concurrent series. One is on 5G, which of course this is part of, and this series is sponsored by Samsung Electronics America, and we're grateful for their support. Wouldn't be able to do this without them. And the second series is on tools for broadband deployment, and we'll be having the second of our series on that front on November 11th. And we'll basically be trading off different weeks over the course of November, December, and extending into January. I want to invite everyone who's watching to share, retweet, and to subscribe to our YouTube and mailing list so that you can get notified when our events happen. Of course, they always happen at Wednesday at 12 noon, so that's an easy way to remember. But I wanted to just give a little more context for this series that we're a part of. The first one 2 weeks ago was on the issue of 5G, just kind of setting the stage for myths, realities, what kinds of issues are raised by the attention and focus on 5G. We had a great panel which set the stage for the subsequent issues, one of which we'll be tackling here today, and that is national security and trusted partners. The other issues we'll be talking about include rights of way, because 5G deployments are going to require 10x or more density of towers and other transceivers. Because of that, we're going to have to wrestle with the rights of way issues, and also a discussion on spectrum and spectrum policies that are necessary for again, the high capacity throughput that we're expecting to see from 5G deployments. We also will have a session on 5G in the enterprise, so we can look specifically about the way 5G deployments are already rolling out and some of the cases and the places where they're having the most impact. But again, today we want to talk about this issue of national security trusted partners. And with me to discuss this topic is a great panel of individuals. I'm going to introduce them in the order that they'll speak off the bat. We have Jim Lewis, who's Senior Vice President at CSIS, Center for Strategic and International Studies. Jim has really been dogged on this issue for years, perhaps even decades. And so I wanted him to kind of set the stage for the issues that are raised by the national security issues raised by the 5G moment that is upon us. Following Jim, we're going to hear from Diane Rinaldo. Diane is the Senior Vice President of Beacon Global Strategies, also involved in the Open RAN Policy Coalition. We'll look forward to hearing more about Open RAN and about that. And of course, Diane was acting administrator of NTIA recently, and she was the point person for the administration on issues including privacy, internet security, 5G, and supply chain management. So again, a wealth of experience she's bringing to this topic and discussion. Following Jim and Diane, we'll hear from Rob Atkinson. Rob's the founder and president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, a very, very prolific think tank on these issues. And batting cleanup, we have Ruth Berry, who's the acting director for bilateral and regional affairs in the Office of International Communications and Information Policy at the State Department. So thank you so much for being with us, Ruth, to be able to give us a take from within the administration. Let's turn it over to you, Jim, to talk, as we discussed, about some of the issues and the threats that come or could come from deploying reliance on 5G partners. So over to you, Jim.
Great, and thank you, and welcome to everyone. It's great to be on this panel. They're all friends, they're all experts, so I won't talk very long. I have been doing this for a while, not as 5G, but as an outgrowth of what you might call intelligence. And Huawei always start in that as the actor you need to work. I love 5G because 5G is the myth and legend, particularly when you look at a lot of the commentary and think tanks. So let's try and talk about what the data is, what the evidence is, what are the trends, and how do we determine where we're going. So a couple key points, I'm sure they made them last week. The US is doing fine. If one more person tells me we're losing the race with 5G, I'll scream. And I'll do that on this panel. That's a threat. The US is doing fine, and brand is damaged. Huawei's brand is damaged. I was in the headquarters of the African Union going up to see the director. And in the elevator, my AU friends told me, the Chinese built our building and installed network. So when you talk, be sure and speak into the walls. Turn an Addis Ababa distrust. Okay. What does that mean that the Chinese has been damaged? Does that mean people will stop buying Huawei or Chinese equipment? And the answer is no, it won't. It makes it a matter of cost, right? And so countries will look at subsidized prices that Huawei offers. We'll now probably have to encourage subsidy, which comes from the Chinese government. That's going to be attractive to a lot of places, right? The last subsidy I saw was 30% under the competitor's bid. That's a whopping discount. And I asked the people who took it, do you think the Chinese gave you a 30% discount because they admire your cooking? But that's what it'll come down to. And that changes some of the tasks for the US. We've done enough in going around to tell people that this is a problem. Need to keep on making sure. And the early reports about the US was being rejected in Europe turn out to be, but we need to focus on that role of the export credit agencies. Some of us call this the Huawei differential. A company or a country might buy from Ericsson or Samsung, but they'll want to have the gap between the price, the market price, and Huawei subsidized closed a little bit. We need to do a better job with things like Exim Bank and external agencies. We need to work with our foreign partners, come up with a coherent and cooperative export assistance plan if we want to reduce Huawei's market share in the rest of the world, right? So that gives this a different focus than what we had before. One of the problems we have with this conflict is it doesn't fit the traditional stovepipes that we've had in the past, and that makes it a little more difficult, at least initially, to deal with. So 5G is, as you know, kind of the merger of telecom and the internet. I was talking to someone this morning and we were reminiscing about having to learn S7, the telecom protocol. It's very efficient. It was a big pain in the neck. I don't think it's very much. Going to IP, internet protocols, as the backbone of how you do telecom. And that changes the whole nature, changes risk, changes opportunity. And that's, Diane can talk about the opportunities that come out of this move. But it also makes telecom security a lot more like cybersecurity. It makes it a cybersecurity problem. So a lot of issues we've confronted when it comes to internet security are now becoming the issues we will confront in the networks of the future. But in fact, security will probably get better if we do this because you'll have computing built into the networks. You'll have more attention to software and semiconductors, the US dominance. But there are challenges, and perhaps one of the biggest ones is how do we work when we have to commit to networks that are less trustworthy? You've all seen the Prague principles. They do a great job. I beg your pardon. The Prague principle does a great job of laying out what the criteria are for trust.
Jim, go ahead and explain briefly for the audience what the Prague principles are. It's just great to assume we don't know. So.
I assume you all know. So about a year ago, a little more, the Secretary of State worked with the Czech government to develop criteria for trusted 5G suppliers, right? And he worked with a European government, Japan, and came out with some standards, not international standards, came out with criteria how you would think about installing trustworthy 5G networks. Just a few weeks ago, the second session came up with additional criteria for trust. It fits very well with the EU 5G toolkit. Recognized in Europe, in Japan, in the US, that you're going in other countries that you're going to need to think about how you buy from trusted suppliers drives a lot of the Prague principle. And frankly, it would qualify as a success, a diplomatic success for the US. So we have an emerging consensus that you need to think about who you buy from, that there's risk if you buy from people, and that you to help perhaps other countries recognize that risk and deal with the fact of a subsidized competitor. But overall, it is always going to be difficult in this environment because opponents are skillful, well-versed, and but when it comes to 5G, we've actually made some progress in the last year or two. So I think I'll stop there and turn it over to the panel. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you again for that great summary. Now, Diane, from your, we're again blessed to have someone who has been in the administration on the NTIA side, and Ruth, who is still in the administration. Tell us the way you looked at the supply chain issues and 5G when you were at NTIA, and also how you view them now in your work through the Open RAN Policy Coalition.
Great. Thanks, Drew. And I appreciate the opportunity to be with you for breakfast at lunchtime, because I think if there's something we can all agree on, that breakfast at lunch is the best. I had I was very lucky in that I was able to work with Ruth closely when I was at NTIA and she was at State. So a lot of these issues overlapped. And from a commerce point of view, we looked at this through the economic lens, right? There's been a long-standing concern with policymakers on who we choose to put in our networks, going back to Mike Rogers introducing the Huawei report in 2011. So from a commerce point of view, we tried to answer the question, if not them, then who? How do we ensure a robust and diverse supply chain moving forward so there's no break of service, there's no concern about who is going to be building out our networks? Earlier this year in March, I had the great fortune of being included in a group of, back then it was 10 companies that had come together to exchange ideas on what is called Open RAN. And Open RAN is the concept of taking the current architecture, which for the most part is a closed proprietary system, and standardizing the interfaces at the ports, so between the radio, the software, the hardware. And so it will allow for a mix and match of component parts. And by doing that, you're going to create more competition within the component subcomponent level, which is going to drive innovation and eventually drop down prices at the end of the day. So the idea of opening up the interfaces in the architecture to drive competition will lead to a constant, robust, and diverse supply chain. I think one problem that we've seen in the telecom ecosystem over the past 20, 30 years, there's been so little venture capital money in this space because the barrier for entry is just too high. You may have a really great idea, but you only have a handful of companies to sell that idea to. And the life cycle is so long, 10 years to switch out networks, that there's just very little room for you to thrive in this market. So the idea, if you have the next best, greatest thing in a radio, that you could actually go directly to a carrier and sell them on your product, and that you would be able to easily remove and place in that new product. And for a carrier, it's going to allow you to customize and optimize to the best needs of your network, whether you're in New York City or my small town of Rumford, Maine, which is 5,000. You want a network that best suits the needs of your customer. So the coalition as it stands today is 56 global companies, not only spanning the globe, but the mobile ecosystem. We have the carriers, we have the vendors with Nokia and Samsung. We have the new entrants into the market, Mavenir and Altia Star. We have the hyperscalers with Amazon and Facebook, in large companies with IBM is the 110-year-old longstanding institution, to brand new startups who have been here for been around for 2 years and are in WeWork spaces in Rosslyn, Virginia. So it's great to see such a diverse group of companies come together to promote the concept of Open RAN. As you can appreciate in working closely with Ruth, is that policymakers, when you have an issue presented to you, you throw a lot of spaghetti on the wall and see what sticks. Some ideas are really good, some ideas fall by the wayside. So it's important to be out there and to be able to communicate and talk about what our member companies are doing in this space, how we're already deploying 12 major deployments globally, with Rakuten that has just announced that they're upgrading their 4G network to 5G. Dish's nationwide build out, they're using an Open RAN concept. So we have been, I would say, blown away by the reception that we have received. And we were thinking just at first domestically, but with the fact that this is a global a global concern that all policymakers are looking at. And so it's something that we have taken time over the past several months to kind of expand our footprint, to focus more on policymakers internationally. We're creating a toolbox to help share best practices around the world. We're advocating on behalf of public-private partnerships, knowing that governments can be the greatest convener, and to get that thumbs up stamp of approval from governments is very important. And as governments look to their own, as Jim mentions, their own international development finance funds for around the world and developing nations, how that can be spent to build up next generation networks, kind of that leap ahead technology. So it's been an honor to work with these companies. It's been quite the 7 months. So it's nice to go from government where you're having an impact to kind of falling right into a similar situation where you're able to work on great issues. It's nonpartisan. It really unites both sides of the party on how we can move forward. And it has all those great words we love to talk about, right? Innovation, economic competitiveness. So it's been, as I said, quite the 7 months, and I appreciate opportunities like this that can help get our message out there.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Diane.
Right.
I certainly got lots of questions, but I want to get the table set, our breakfast table
Right.
for lunch, as you aptly point out, with some ideas, thoughts, perhaps some contrarian points of view. I hope what we'll hear as we turned over to Rob Atkinson of ITIF. Tell us, Rob, how do you view this issue, and what are some of the principles that need to be considered as we talk about 5G and national security implications as you see them? So go ahead, Rob. Okay, make sure to, I'm trying to unmute you, but it's not letting me, so.
Hear me now?
Yeah, there we go, great.
All right, good, I thought, yeah, you were in meeting. So, thank you for having me join you. I think this issue gets so confused in the public debate, because there's really two completely separate issues. The one issue is how are we doing in terms of rolling out 5G networks in the US? And the other issue is how are we doing in terms of who's producing or manufacturing those networks. And on the latter or the former issue, we're doing fine. We're rolling out 5G. We'll do that. We should probably free up more spectrum, mid-band spectrum, but we're doing fine. And all of these notions somehow the Chinese have more base stations than ours, it appears that that's vastly overstated by both the inefficiency of their spectrum and just their measurement issues. They kind of overinflate how many base stations they have. So we shouldn't really, I don't think, panic too much. I agree with Jim that we're doing fine there. The second issue is really about Huawei itself and the vulnerabilities in our network. And I fully agree with the Trump administration and many other governments that have decided to ban Huawei from the networks because you can't trust their networks. And that's partly them, perhaps. It's partly the way the Chinese government has set up their rules. So that's fine. Then the question then becomes, well, what should we do about that? And I think we have to remember, a couple things. One is, if we're worried about the security of our networks, all we have to do is ban Huawei, ZTE, and other Chinese companies from our networks, which is something the Trump administration has already done. We're good to go. Where I have a problem is when we start going, well, we better see if we could cripple or even kill Huawei by export controls. That sometimes gets justified in terms of, well, we can't have Huawei survive because of cybersecurity. I just don't buy that. We ban them from our networks. We've banned them from our networks. The problem with going after Huawei in terms of limiting their access to US technology is it sounds good, it feels good. Oh yeah, maybe we can hurt them. Problem is we're hurting ourselves when we do that. It's not as if Huawei, number one, they've just developed their own Android alternative. So, you know, probably going forward, there's a US product that's not going to be sold. It'll be their own operating system. When we ban chips sales to Huawei, it's not as if somehow they're going to, you know, shut down. They're able to get them from other allied partners, the Taiwanese, the Japanese, the Koreans themselves. So I really worry about it. If we're going to do export controls to China, at minimum, it should be done with our allies, and otherwise, I just think we're shooting ourselves in the foot. And then lastly, this issue of and by the way, we in some ways don't have to worry about equipment because we have at least 3 companies that are in allied partners, Nokia, Samsung, which you mentioned, and Ericsson. There's a recent report that we did looking at the effect of Chinese, what we call innovation mercantilism, on global innovation in the telecom equipment industry. And what was very clear was that when you look at it from a per dollar per sales basis, that Huawei is not all that innovative. It's certainly not as innovative as Nokia or Samsung or Ericsson. And these are perfectly innovative companies, and there's no reason we shouldn't continue to say, well, we'll let them, you know, we'll rely on them. We don't have to build our own domestic replacement. Having said that, ORAN is a good thing, and you know, moving forward with ORAN, it's an interesting and hopefully important innovation that, you know, perhaps could have U.S. regain some capabilities there. I just want to close by saying, you know, Diane talked about, you know, barriers to entry and all that, which is true, but the question almost no one asks is, well, why is there why do we need entry? In 2000, we had the largest, most innovative, most successful telecom equipment companies, and that was Lucent, which used to be Western Electric, and Nortel, which is Canadian, but the majority of their jobs were in the United States. And I wrote a recent article for the Journal of American Affairs called "Who Lost Lucent?" And it went through this long history, all the way back to the 1880s. And how the U.S. built up to be the greatest telecom equipment producer in the world. And then we lost it all within just a few years. Between 2000 and 2008, essentially, was gone. And you go back and you look at the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, nobody said anything. Nobody said, oh, this is a problem. It's like, oh, well, so what? We'll lose it. And yet, if you look at the history of why we lost it, it was a really interesting combination of factors. Aggressive antitrust, like we're seeing right now in high tech. Aggressive antitrust was significant number of errors, significant, all the way back to 1924 when they forced Western Electric to divest all of its foreign assets, and just going all the way down the line. The Telecom Act of '96 that sort of created this artificial investment splurge that Lucent fell into the trap and then couldn't get out of. The inability or unwillingness to us to finance export financing that other countries did, unwillingness to have a domestic strategy around the industry. And so, you know, now we lost that industry, and you know, maybe we'll get it back with kind of a Schumpeterian technology disruption of a whole new way of doing it, and I hope that's the case. But I think it suggests that we should be a lot more careful going forward and a lot more modest about some of the government actions that are taken for different reasons, because you could easily see us losing semiconductors, a whole set of other industries if we're not careful. I think it's a really important lesson that we should be taking from this. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Wow, excellent point, and again raises some good points for discussion as we proceed forward. Ruth, let's turn it over to you and to discuss your perspective from where you sit as you look at this issue of 5G and national security.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm glad to be speaking with these distinguished panelists today on an issue that I have spent personally a lot of time working on in the past 2 years. So the Department of State launched an international campaign to work with our partners and allies to help them understand the risks of untrusted vendors in 5G networks. This started in early 2019 and has been going, I would say, full steam ahead since then. First, I'd like to talk a little bit about why we care about this and why we see this as an international foreign policy and national security issue. As folks are aware, and as has been discussed previously, 5G technologies will be transformational. With low latency, the ability to process vastly increased amounts of data, and the ability to host millions of more devices will fundamentally change almost every aspect of our lives and will underpin a lot of critical and essential services, as well as new technologies, things such as telehealth, electrical and water distribution, Internet of Things, autonomous vehicles, smart manufacturing, artificial intelligence, and others. With this transformational potential and the impacts on so many aspects of our lives, the stakes for securing these networks could not be higher. And deployment decisions made today around the world can have generational impacts on security, the economy, human rights, and citizens' privacies. One thing I want to make clear is that we recognize that threats and vulnerabilities will exist in any network and hardware and software components. So it's important that customers and countries adopt and deploy cybersecurity best practices to protect those networks. However, at a baseline minimum, you need to be able to trust that these hardware and software component vendors will act in the best interests of their consumers and will address any issues that may arise with integrity. Why we talk a lot about our concerns with Huawei and ZTE as not being a trusted vendor is in many ways related to non-technical factors and to geopolitical factors. Under Chinese national intelligence law, any Chinese entity, which includes a company, is compelled to cooperate in secret with Chinese national intelligence services. And they can be compelled to manipulate, disrupt, or conduct espionage over these critical networks. With the trend towards 5G networks being more software driven, as Jim Lewis had said, the sort of combination of telecommunications and the internet, the ability and frankly the necessity to remotely access and update these networks means that there is no safe place in the network, whether the core or the radio access network, for untrusted vendors such as Huawei and ZTE. And allowing these vendors into 5G networks will put sensitive government, commercial, and personal information at risk. So with this baseline understanding of what the national security and economic concerns are, we have spent the last 2 years engaging with partners and allies around the world. And I'm happy to say that this campaign is bearing fruit. And I think particularly in Europe, the tide has turned. The Prague proposals, which Jim Lewis mentioned previously, and the EU's toolbox on 5G cybersecurity paved the way for countries to start to adopt and put in place rigorous evaluation measures that include the consideration of non-technical and geopolitical factors when deploying their 5G networks. Today, approximately 25 EU and NATO countries have put in place or are committed to putting in place strong measures to secure their 5G networks. And globally, nearly 40 countries are taking action. Just last week, the United States signed 4 5G security memorandums of understanding with Slovakia, Bulgaria, Kosovo, and North Macedonia, bringing the total number of agreements on 5G security to 12. And it's not just countries. Nearly 50 telecommunications carriers and technology companies have committed to secure and trusted 5G and have joined with the United States in the Clean Network. So when we think about where we go from here, progress still needs to be made, particularly outside of Europe and around the globe, to offer competitive, trusted alternatives and innovative new solutions to meet the connectivity challenges, particularly in emerging markets who are cost sensitive. Key to this is the opportunities provided by new technologies such as open radio access networks and other innovative solutions that can offer increased vendor diversity, reduce cost, and enhance 5G capabilities. I would also like to mention that while the subject of today's conversation is 5G security, these threats posed by untrusted vendors or authoritarian state actors is not limited to just 5G. And I think it's important to think about these threats across the broader ICT or information and communications technology ecosystem. This is why the Department of State launched the Clean Network, which is rooted in internationally accepted digital trust standards, such as the Prague Proposals or the Standards for Trust and Security in ICT Systems that Jim Lewis and CSIS put together, and represents an enduring strategy to build coalitions of trusted partners that address the long-term threats to data privacy, intellectual property, security, and human rights that are posed from authoritarian or malign actors such as the Chinese Communist Party. I do want to be clear about one thing before I close, is that our efforts to promote 5G security and other actions are not about a conflict between the United States and China. This is about the promotion of values that are shared across democracies around the world, and an effort to push back on the PRC's systemic efforts to export not just technology, but a legal and technical framework of a top-down authoritarian control over the internet. And the US and like-minded countries' efforts to promote our values of human rights, privacy, and other democratic values.
Wow, awesome. Ruth, I've got several questions for you that I want to dive in, and then we can broaden it to the panel. You kind of talked about how this really began only a year and a half ago, 2019, and some of the work that has happened. You said, you feel the tide is beginning to change in Europe, not necessarily in the sense that I was on a panel 2 weeks ago hosted out of Europe, and I mean it's kind of night and day. There almost seems to be fragmenting worlds of the internet, if you will, between different spheres of influence. So Ruth, could you just talk a little bit more about how it came to be that you and others in the State Department and the administration said we need to start tackling this challenge in 2019, a year and a half ago?
I think that's a good question. So it certainly was really kicked off, I think, at the direction of Secretary Pompeo in early 2019. And I think sort of what pushed action on these is that countries, particularly in Europe, were looking to make 5G decisions. But I will also say that this has truly been a whole of government effort under, the leadership of, President Trump and this administration and the White House. And I think we've really worked together quite seamlessly, I would say, across domestic and foreign policy agencies. There's a number of steps being taken domestically to secure our own networks, and then working together to sort of engage with partners on what steps they can take to secure their networks.
And of course, as Rob earlier laid out, there's kind of issues that sometimes get conflated: the progress of the U.S. in 5G and 5G networks versus this question of security. What are some of the best practices that the State Department is asking of technology companies to be able to, verify that equipment is secure? I mean, to the extent that we're in the nitty gritty of making sure that we have secure networks, what are some of the best practices to follow?
So when we engage with our international partners on this issue, I think we're very focused on the outcome, which is that we believe a rigorous evaluation of the risks posed should result in the exclusion of untrusted vendors from all parts of their 5G networks. However, we are not proscriptive about exactly how they conduct those evaluations. I think the Prague proposals provide a good guide. As I'd said, CSIS's principles of trust and security also provide good evaluation criteria. But I think one important factor that I mentioned before is that you also have to take into account non-technical geopolitical factors, and whether or not vendors are subject to the control of a third government without any judicial checks and balances or democratic checks and balances.
Well, let me use that to pivot to Rob's point about the demise of American telecommunications equipment providers. Although, as Rob, you point out, Nokia Ericsson, Samsung are all in Western countries, provide a good chunk, albeit in a race for market share against the other vendors that Ruth and others have mentioned. Rob, could you speak to this concern about losing the semiconductor industry and the historical perspective you brought on this? What happened from 2000 to 2008 that led to the loss of a American telecommunications equipment industry, and what are the perhaps greater risks of a semiconductor loss?
Sure. I mean, I can't do that justice to that because it's a pretty multifaceted thing, but just briefly, um, we lost that industry in part because we had systematically weakened it over the years particularly through antitrust policy, where we divested Bell Labs, and that was a huge mistake, et cetera. But one of the main reasons by 2008 why both of those companies went under, it was really China. In fact, I'm all for banning Huawei globally, even if if it had nothing to do with cybersecurity risk or democracy risk, which it does. I would be all for banning Huawei, because even Mr. Ren, the Huawei founder, admitted that without the Chinese government, Huawei wouldn't exist. This is a company that owes its entire existence to Chinese unfair practices, starting with forced commercialization, forced localization, and forced tech transfer back in the late 80s. Massive subsidies. The Wall Street Journal showed they received $70 billion of subsidies. They just wouldn't exist. You take Nortel, for example. When Nortel went out of business in 2008, it sold its facility to the Canadian Defense Department, and they went in there, and before they occupied it, they had their electronics guys go in and monitor the building, and they found it was chock full of listening devices. Guess who put those there? They also, the head of networks for Nortel or IT, found that that the Chinese had been inside through cyber espionage in the Nortel networks from 1998, basically stealing everything that they had. So anyway, now to switch over to semiconductors. Well, semiconductors are a little bit different in the sense that we're still ahead of the Chinese. But the problem is that they just did their second round of 27 billion or so in their national semiconductor fund. All of it, by the way, WTO illegal. This is now 50 billion they've put in, plus another 50 to 75 billion that the provincial governments have put in. They're just going to spend whatever it takes to build up a global semiconductor industry. They're going to start with what are called DRAMs, memory chips, and that ultimately is going to hurt U.S. companies, is going to reduce their margins. And so I think we've got to think about how we want to respond to that. Both, by the way, that's why we are big supporters of the CHIPS Act that Congress has put in the NDAA.
Well, what's to be done globally, Jim and Diane? I mean, is there any hope for détente, so to speak, in this Cold War, or are we just going to, U.S. and as many allies as we can get internationally versus China as many allies as they can get internationally? Let's turn to Jim first, and then Diane. Jim, sorry. There you go. Thank you.
There you go. I like that they're trying to get the allies. Right now, I think they've got North Korea and Cambodia. So off to a great start. There might be, and this is a little more worrisome, there might be some sort of partnership between China and Russia. They have a shared goal, which is to undermine Western democracy, but the Russians really don't trust the Chinese for the reasons you just heard Rob talk about. So I don't think there's room for China to build an alliance. It can buy from, it just bought Hungary. I forget what the was, but it's not going to have allies, because part of the ally of China is you have to admit that Xi Jinping is at the center of the world. Now, there's no room for negotiation. Not right now. The Chinese think that, we're in decline. You can make a case for that. The West is in decline. And so why negotiate when, if they wait years, we'll be here and they can get a better deal. So I think it's going to be for a while. The Trump administration, to its credit, decided to take China. And now I think there's a consensus on Capitol Hill that this is what we need to do. There's a growing consensus, at least among the democracies in Europe, that this is what we need to do. So I think détente is not in the cards, certainly for the next 5 years or so.
Diane, do you want to address that question or some of these others we've already talked through a little bit?
Sure. So I will just say that when I was at NTIA and would travel around the world and talk to my counterparts on why they would choose to kind of go with one vendor over the other, I'd say first and foremost, it was cost. Second, it was the easy button. It's convenient to have one phone call to make to build the network, to service the network. And also in Europe and other places around the world, they're so heavily regulated. Going with one Chinese vendor compared to a European vendor could mean the difference of being in the black and being the red. So I think at the coalition, how we've looked at these issues, and again, right, we didn't form because of any one company or any one region of the world, but this is the world that we're currently living in, is how can we make it more competitive? And so when there is a viable choice in the marketplace, as far as, U.S.-China policy moving forward, it's really unfortunate. And you would hope that would come to a point where our nations could work into exchange economic prosperity together. But the fact of the matter is that we need to ensure that we continue on our path for robust and diverse economic ecosystem here in the United States, working with allies around the world. And I think that's what I enjoy best about the coalition that we've assembled, is that you have brought together so many diverse companies to talk about these issues and kind of figure out a way to move forward from the economic strategic end. But the next 4 years will be interesting to watch from a policy standpoint on how either a Trump second administration or Biden's first administration will handle these issues going forward, because they're certainly not
Jim
going
made
away
the point
anytime
that
soon.
there's now effectively a bipartisan consensus of concern about the role that China and Chinese equipment companies play in this space. And again, we've tried to kind of dissect those, talk about the nuances, but I certainly want to ask if that is indeed, your view, Rob and Ruth and Diane. Do you see anything changing no matter what happens 6 days from now in terms of the U.S. policy on this issue vis-a-vis China and Chinese companies?
No, I think tactics will be different, maybe a little less tweeting, but I think that policies will stand.
So I'm not as maybe as confident in that for two reasons. One, I agree that we've moved to, we're not going back to Obama, particularly Obama term one. Those days are gone. And even the sort of most friendly free traders now, they know that they have to put a but in front of what they say. Well, but there's China, and that's not going to go away. I agree with that. But on the other hand, there's a pretty big size of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party now that really does discount China. For them, they would want to do a Green New Deal and make sure that every home has insulation and frankly ignore really important technology competitiveness questions vis-a-vis China. Now, I don't know how much sway they would have in a Biden administration, but I think they would have some. I'm sorry, Rob,
could I just get you to clarify? What do you mean ignore competitive concerns with China? What is it that progressives would do that would ignore competitive concerns with China?
Well, if you think, for example, of the Endless Frontier Act that that Schumer and Senator Young from Indiana did, there were a lot of progressives, or a number of progressives, that came out and said, why are you focusing on things like quantum computing and semiconductors? We should be focusing on clean water and clean air. Maybe, sure, but if we don't address these really core technology industry challenges where the Chinese are gunning for us with Made in China 2025 and the new Strategic and Emerging Industries Plan, they're going after these industries. There's no question about that. And they probably will win unless we take better steps domestically. And I think there are some folks on the left side of the party that really just fundamentally don't even think that we're in competition with other countries and that this is just a big corporate welfare handout. Much better to give money to low income people, basic income, and do a Green New Deal. And I'm not saying that's going to be happening, but there is going to be a tension on the Democratic side, I believe, going forward.
I mean, what you're arguing for is industrial policy, and that became a bit of a bad word, and now you're embracing it, as I hear it, Rob, and you're saying this is actually the consensus right now, that we as a nation need to have greater incentives and subsidizations. Would you agree or disagree, Rob, and others?
I've embraced it since I got to Washington in 1989. I've never given up on it, and now I'm pretty happy because, for example, if you look at the Republican House Republican China Task Force or Working Group that Chairman McCall led, that doesn't look like a Freedom Caucus report to me. I mean, they're talking essentially about some kind of industrial policy vis-a-vis China. So yeah, I do. And then, look at the Biden Build Back Better plan. There's a lot of things in there that if you want to call it industrial policy, feel free. But so in that sense, I think we've crossed the Rubicon. We've turned the corner. There's now much more of a consensus. It's not a dirty word anymore, but it's not completely clear sailing either, would be my point.
Ruth, I'll give you a chance to weigh in on this issue. Any perspective on how this policy of concern, and as you've kind of repeatedly called it, raise the geopolitical question in buying decisions, is that going to change in the future, or is there sort of a stable consensus behind that? Go ahead, Ruth. And
I can just speak from sort of the international perspective. I think we have experienced broad bipartisan support on the importance of this issue. And I think, what we have heard from the private sector around the world, including carriers, is that nobody believes that there is enough diversity in the supply chain as it stands. And so I think the demand for innovative new technologies and greater vendor diversity, and frankly, a more level playing field. I think, Huawei, although I didn't get into it in my remarks, does have a history of unethical corporate behavior. They benefit from, strong market dominance in China, which enables them to essentially, offer below market rates around the world to try and get their technology into these networks and push out the competition, with goals of vendor lock-in. So I think that this trend is going to continue, and that it has come far enough that regardless of sort of what happens over the coming weeks, this is something that will continue to be important to the United States as a matter of national security, but also to our partners and allies around the world.
I also want to raise the question about how rapid the change has been in sending out information about this panel. And below this video, if you're watching on Broadband Breakfast, you have an article from Rob, I think it was just February, where some folks from ITIF were speaking about the Huawei derangement syndrome. Now, maybe that was just one person's comment, but this has changed so rapidly. And yes, it's a bipartisan change that's happened. But I'm just wondering, is there any concerns about how rapidly this has changed? Rob, do you want to?
Oh, sorry. I wasn't sure who that was to do. Yeah, just to be clear, when I don't know, I think I said that. I wasn't referring at all to the fact that we shouldn't ban Huawei in the network. I fully 100% agree with that. And as I said, I wrote an op-ed in an Italian paper. Absolutely we should ban them. My only point is, we should be looking out for our national interest. That's and the secondly, global interest. And my point was, there's so much animosity and sort of almost craziness around Huawei, that when it starts going into hurting ourselves by telling U.S. exporters that they can't sell to Huawei, I just don't see what that gets us. I actually think that hurts us in the long run. And that was what I meant by that. Not that we shouldn't ban them in the network, but when we tell our companies you can't sell to Huawei, I think they just buy it from somebody else and you get hurt.
That is an excellent point, and it ties into the semiconductor point that you raised earlier. I'd love to get the other panelists' perspective on this point that you thankfully have clarified for us. Jim and Diane and Ruth, do you think that that issue of banning sales to Huawei is counterproductive, like Rob feels?
It's a hard line to draw between where there are places we can still make money in China without hurting national security. And the Commerce Department has been wrestling with this as it tries to modernize our export controls, which are now more than 20 years old. So we can't make fun of the Chinese for being 8 years out of date. We're, a little behind too. It's a hard line to say, yeah, it's okay to sell this. I'd agree with Rob that, certainly for some chips, they're easy to go. One of the questions that came up was, should people be able to sell to the People's Liberation Army? And the commerce rules now say, correctly, I think, not without a license. So we're going to have to wrestle through with this identifying what's safe to continue. There's a lot, right? And where we need to maybe tighten up a little bit. On this, the Europeans and the Japanese are moving in our direction if they aren't already there. It was the Japanese who first proposed that we ought to tighten up on semiconductor exports to China. And so there's a growing concern, and it's China's behavior that drives this. We did a series of interviews about Chinese investment in Europe, my colleague Heather Conley and I. And one thing that surprised us is, because we didn't ask it, is every single person we interviewed, government officials, financial sector, companies, every single person European brought up Hong Kong and said, look at what they're doing in Hong Kong. How can you trust a country like this? So the Chinese are their own worst enemy, and they don't have a choice, just as no American president would want to be called soft on China. And I think that will argue for more consistency. There'll be a little bit of the Mr. Rogers neighborhood approach at the beginning, but that'll go away. But just as no American president wants to be called soft on China, no Chinese leader can afford to make dramatic changes in their policies. And that means I think we're on the path towards more tension, not less.
Diane?
Yeah, just to follow up on what Jim said. I mean, these issues aren't going away, and they're not going to get any easier. We had been focusing on military use for so long, but now that technology is driving everything, it's really hard to differentiate what is military use and what is for domestic commercial use. So I don't envy my former colleagues over at BIS and the tasks at hand and issuing license and trying to make these tough decisions. So I will just leave it at that. I don't have a strong opinion one way or another, other than these are tough decisions we're going to deal with in the foreseeable future, and we need to be able to make a decision and figure out how to ensure our industries are able to continue to thrive under whatever rules come out in the years to come.
Thank you, Diane. And we understand as Ruth's at the State Department, she's not able to address issues of export control. But I do want to kind of maybe lean towards our last topic, unless others come up, or if questioners, if watchers want to tweet or send through one of our channels questions, we're happy to entertain those too. But I'd love to get the panel's take on the notion of the D10, right? I mean, we've heard, of course, about the G20 group of economies, and then the G7, and this issue of whether non-democratic states like Russia should be part of it. But there's some increasing attention. I think it was a foreign policy article that Jim referred me to on the D10, and how that is to say the 10 largest democracies around the world, and how they could be a force on this 5G question. And this has permeated our discussion today, right? The global concerns, the strategic concerns, geopolitical that Ruth has raised, and that others have spoken about too. What is the way to work with allies? Why has the trend changed in Europe, if it indeed it has? What are the steps towards markets like India and other democratic nations like South Korea and Japan? What's the state of U.S. telecommunications and sort of the democratic alternative. And again, let's just hear everyone's point of view on this question of working with democratic allies.
I can kick off, but of course, very interested in the views of the other panelists as well. I mean, I think from the Department of State and the foreign policy perspective, this is absolutely critical. And I think this is both thinking about, manufacturing and trusted supply chains, and how we sort of promote a vibrant and robust supply chain with a lot of vendor diversity, but also thinking about what are other values that we can share and work together on when it comes to the management and global governance of the internet, and promoting one that is interoperable, reliable, and secure. I think, particularly with Europe and the EU, there's a lot of, you start to hear discussions about digital sovereignty. And so what we do not want is this to sort of turn into a balkanization of the internet or, forced data localization, but rather think about how we can work together to maintain the internet's open character, while also promoting trust and security within the supply chain. But of course, to us, key to that is engaging with like-minded democratic partners, including Japan, including South Korea, including Europe.
Yeah, I can just add to that from the coalition standpoint, the international aspect of what we do is so important. Again, right, from an economic lens, the concern that we all wake up one day and there's only one player in this space, that one player has priced everyone out of the market, and then what do we do? So how can we build up a more robust and diverse supply chain? How can we work with counterparts around the world to ensure that more spectrum is being made available, that networks are being built in a safe fashion, that we're able to maintain the health of those networks going forward? So as we know, and 5G has heightened the awareness around that networks are global in nature. Everything's interconnected. All of our financial systems, all of our the economics of our country all rides on the latest technologies. So it's important that we maintain the healthy supply chain. It's important that countries come together to discuss best practices. Everyone is, as you mentioned earlier, it seems like these issues have kind of popped up out of nowhere, but they have been percolating for a long time. And the rapid expansion and deployment of 5G has really heightened it and kind of brought it to a head. But again, these issues aren't going away, and it's good that people are coming together and dealing with them now. It puts everyone on a good footing going forward.
What's the best next step, Diane, to kind of advance these issues in that kind of democratic global forum?
Sure. So yeah, right. You mentioned the D10. There are other ideas on how to best promote technology in different governmental circles. So I would say from our point, first and foremost, is education. We believe that the future is Open RAN. It's how quickly we get there is kind of like the looming question. And so international cooperation is a big component of that, as well as public-private partnerships. How can governments work together with the private industry, similar to what we're doing through our DoD, working on test beds. And they just named a multitude of different companies giving $600 million to move forward on building out test beds. It's things like that that heighten the awareness, and allows people to go forth to other developing nations as they're building out 5G for additional offerings.
Jim and Rob, what are your thoughts on this question?
Well, I can go, I guess. I think, look, I think the $64,000 question, as they say, is, can anything be done to pull China back from its unrepentant and destructive innovation mercantilism? In the Kennan sense, can we roll back some of that? And I don't know the answer to that. I think what we do know now is that what we've done so far hasn't done that. The Trump tariffs and other pressure hasn't really dented what the Chinese are doing. So what could the only other thing we could do? Well, you could try the WTO, but I think that's pretty much toothless. We saw that with the recent Boeing decision, ridiculous decision. I think the only other answer then is, could we build an alliance of countries that have intestinal fortitude and are willing to stand up to Chinese pressure? I don't know. I doubt that a country like Germany is willing to do that. To me, Germany wants to have their cake and eat it too. They want us to protect them, and yet they want to have all the economic benefits from China. I think Japan is a little bit different. The UK, the Commonwealth countries. So I would start with a small group of countries who are willing to take some pain. We're the only country so far that's been willing to suffer any pain out of this. And I think it's, I think it's ridiculous that we're doing it and we don't have allies and friends that are willing to take pain. Unless we do that and then are willing to impose pain on the Chinese to get them to roll back. I don't expect them to roll back everything. But I do expect them to stop, massive intellectual property theft. I expect them to cut their subsidies by 75%. No more forced tech transfer, even though they say they're not doing it. But I assume, last thing I'll just say, I hope we can do that, whether it's D10 or some other kind of body. Clyde Prestowitz and I proposed a NATO for trade recently in the Washington Post. But if we can't do that, what we should do, no matter what, as an insurance policy, is a robust national industrial strategy, a strategy that would include ORAN, Diane, but also other areas of technology that we have to be able to be competitive in.
Well, wonderful. Let's give Jim the last word here. What are your thoughts on how to tackle this?
I'm always suspicious of any proposal that sounds like the name of a sunscreen. So D10. These are hard to do. I think Ruth, I was at State for a long time, easy to say, hard to actually make it work. And to Rob's point, we have a good partnership with the Japanese, with the Australians. They live near China. They're already, in a confrontational. And I would say the Australians have taken some pain, but the Europeans, we could get them, but we're going to need to answer two questions, privacy and competitiveness, right? We need to address those issues to get the Europeans on board. And whether that's Trump or Biden, that's the task for the next administration. There's an incipient grouping of people willing to push back on China, of countries willing to push back on China. But it will take us to pull it together. And that's the task for whoever it is, whether it's Trump or Biden. Build that coalition. Just don't name it after a Michael.
Well, great. And with that, we'll let that be the last word. Thank you so much to Jim, Diane, Rob, and Ruth for being with us for this hour on Broadband Breakfast Live Online. I just want to, again, thank our sponsor, Samsung Electronics America, for this series. A no-nonsense guide to 5G. We'll be back again for the next episode in this series on November 18th. In the meantime, next week, November 4th, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to invite all of you to join in. Obviously, it's the day after Election Day. We'll be talking about results or the extent of results we've got, its impact on broadband. And we're going to do it through a different platform so that everyone can interact with one another instead of just watching our conversation here and interacting. So watch for more information on that on broadbandbreakfast.com. Thanks for being with us. I'm Drew Clark, editor and publisher. See you next week, Wednesday at 12.